Hello, welcome to Symphony Preview. As always, we're here to talk about a concert, upcoming concert at the Helena Civic Center with the Helena Symphony, and with me today, as usual, music director for the Helena Symphony, Maestro Alan R. Scott. Thanks for coming again.
Of course.
We're going to talk about a March 23rd concert. Starts at 7:30 as they usually do. This is an all classical concert. It includes two overtures or overture-like short pieces, a symphony and a concerto. Big package, all wrapped in a time frame, the classical era. And as I've read from your notes, this was a very short period of time, 1750 to 1820.
Yeah.
But in that time frame, lots of things were happening. It was sort of packed with history. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Enlightenment. So we're not here to talk about that period so much, but about some of the music that has sprouted from this very creative period in classical music history. So let's start with the beginning of the concert. A short piece by Beethoven from it was an opera or a play?
A play.
Called Coriolan, similar to Coriolanus, a Shakespeare piece that people may be familiar with.
Right.
So let's start there.
Yeah, I just think it's important to say, though, that the classical period, we often call all this music classical. Oh, I'm going to a classical music concert. But capital letter C classical is a very specific period, and a lot of people often don't know that. And it's taking that term from the classical period in literature, architecture, which is about a century before. The first, and so it predates, the musical periods use these literary periods, but about a century and a half later. Beethoven, we not skirt around, but touch on. We don't do anything very long, because Beethoven really is the bridge between the classical period and the period that came after, the romantic period. So we begin and end the concert with Beethoven, sort of the shadow of Beethoven lurking there to come, what's coming next. But the capital letter C classical period of music, like you said, it's one of the most historic periods in time, yet it's the shortest period of music. And we call all this classical music. It's interesting why we call that, but it's the period that's mainly dominated by Haydn. The period where we're not going to go into all what's the history of that, but the way that people were thinking in that period is so important, how it influences not only the French and American revolutions, but architecture and certainly music. And that is, a century before, they looked more towards the heavens, towards their answer, especially in the Baroque period. Here, they're looking more towards science, towards the stars.
Yeah.
And so much so that Haydn really becomes the composer who developed. He's the father of this period, Franz Joseph Haydn.
They call him Papa Haydn.
Papa Haydn or Joe Haydn. And Haydn worked for the Esterhazy estate, this very famous family in Austria. And they developed, not only in the string quartet, but in the symphony, sort of a mathematical formula known as the sonata allegro form, usually used in the first, second, often last movement of a string quartet and a symphony. And if I had a blackboard to diagram what it would be using A's and B's and C's, it would take me a lot of space. I could do it very simply, but it's literally a mathematical formula that they used, that they plugged in, where you have an introduction and then an exposition, and you have two themes in the exposition that are bridged by a key change, a modulation. Then you have a development section which expands on those two themes. Then you go back and you do a recapitulation, which is recapitulating the exposition with A and B, but no key change between them. And then you have a coda, and that's just the first movement. And I could diagram, I'm broad brush here, but if I were to diagram each of those parts, it would take a lot of material to do. But they use this very mathematical formula. It's very balanced. Symmetrical ideas are very important, just like being from Philadelphia, the best example is Independence Hall. It's classical architecture, which is the old Pennsylvania State House. What happens on the left, it happens on the right. Symmetry. Even when you will go into Independence Hall, it's on the $100 bill, but if you go into the Independence Hall, where the judiciary branch, during when Pennsylvania was a colony, behind the judges, there's a door on our right. But there's also a door on the left. But if you look carefully, one of those doors does not even have hinges. But just to make things balanced, they have put a door on both sides. This idea that things need to be, if it happens this way musically, when it repeats, it will happen identically. this is what the classical period is about. One melody dominating, where in the Baroque period is multiple melodies going on at once. One melody supported by the accompaniment. So this idea of classical period is very specific what it means. The Romantics take that classical period and start, it's less about the rules and the process than it is about expression and the art. So while we know Mozart probably is the most famous classical composer and the early works of Beethoven, Haydn is the most important. He is the composer that everybody followed. He wrote 104 symphonies compared to Mozart's 41. He lived twice as long as Mozart. He influences composers like Beethoven, like Mozart.
Yeah.
So Haydn is so important in this period.
I think you actually described him as the destination point in this period. Like all things gravitated to Haydn.
Yes.
Because he was the center pivot.
Yeah, he absolutely. And he, even though he was sort of isolated. He worked for this very wealthy family, and eventually, when they died off, he still was on the payroll, but he was able to travel to London. He was so revered, and his last several symphonies are known as the London Symphonies. But he was sort of the composer that everybody looked towards. How should we do this? Mozart looked towards him too.
Yeah, if you hang on for a second, there's a quote that you included in your notes by Mozart of Haydn, and he says, "There's no one who can do it all. To joke and to terrify, to evoke laughter and profound sentiment, and all equally well, except Joseph Haydn." So quite a tribute from Mozart to the father figure.
And Joe Haydn was, literally, when they said Papa Haydn, that wasn't like sort of just tongue-in-cheek. They really looked up to him. I mean, even when on his deathbed, you know, and they wheeled him in on a wheelchair to play some music, and I mean, it was just like you were in presence of a god, and then as he's carried off in this wheelchair, he just puts his hand up in the air, and everybody almost genuflects to it. I mean, this is right before he died. But to get back to the original question, we will start and end with 2 Beethoven overtures. You don't usually end a concert with an overture, but I'm doing this deliberately to sort of bookend that Beethoven is sort of the future here, but the overture that we start with, this Coriolan overture, brief, it's under 10 minutes, based on the Shakespearean character. And it's a darker overture, but it's very Beethoven. It's still in the classical vein, very structured, but has that undercurrent of striving for something more.
Yeah, a general attacking Rome, if I recall.
Yes, yes, right.
And killing himself.
And he wrote that for this play, that the incidental music, I think, is almost non-existent other than this overture for it. We'll end the concert equally with the Beethoven overture to a ballet, Creatures from Prometheus. And it's a very short overture, but very uplifting, very fun, very energetic, you almost feel something, you feel the giving birth of this idea of that just everything is happening. It's so exciting and what's about to happen using this Greek play, and he uses the ballet. So these 2 Beethoven overtures are not very long. There's not tons and tons of depth of thought, but they're Beethoven nonetheless, but they are still in the classical vein.
As usual, see, when I read about this, I'm thinking, well, once again, the concert itself is a composition. I mean, some thought goes into how to juxtapose these pieces, what leads to the other, and how to wrap it all. So in particular, this concert struck me as, he's composed a classical era concert.
Yeah.
And backing up to Haydn, in this instance, it's a cello concerto. And a friend of yours who we've come to love here in Helena, Ovidiu Marinescu. Ovidiu Marinescu, a Romanian-born musician, is coming again.
Yeah, he's been here. He's probably more here than any other soloist we've had. He's been a few years since but he's so loved. People love him, so I bring him back because he and I have been performing together over 20 years. But we're dear friends. But this is the one concerto we've never done together. And I've conducted this concerto so many times, and he's played it probably thousands of times, it seems. This is one of it really became popular in the 1960s. It was not really well known. People weren't sure that Haydn even wrote it at first. But it's Haydn's C major cello concerto. It's everything that Haydn is and that we expect him to be. Charming and fun, beautiful and sentimental. Haydn had a wonderful sense of humor. He's like the best dinner party guest you could want. Mozart, the exact opposite. Mozart is odd and awkward and sort of just a fish out of water all the time, where Haydn is not. Haydn is charming is the best word I could think about his music, and he is.
There hasn't been a movie about Haydn, has there? I mean,
I don't know.
We
not
know
that
there's
I know
movies about, or at least a
Mozart.
big one about.
Because
Mozart.
Haydn was sort of just a great guy, and
Yeah.
everybody loved. Even though he's sort of secluded with his job, he knew everybody and was so loved, and just as a person, very respected, and not every piece was a hit of his 104 symphonies. His later symphonies are very popular, but this cello concerto is just so wonderful and so beautiful and so virtuosic. It's one of the hardest cello concertos there is, but it speaks to everything that the classical music of that era is, and people love it when they hear it. They might not know it per se, but the moment they're engaged with it, they go down this journey, and it's just no work is terribly long. It's about a 30-minute work. Yeah. And then we do a Mozart symphony.
Right. So after intermission, no doubt.
Right.
So yeah, you've packed a symphony into this package, and it's called the Prague Symphony. And I know so little about it other than Mozart. As you say, it was kind of an odd duck. Not everybody liked him, but the people of Prague, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, probably,
right,
took a shine to him. So he's very popular there, and I gather that this particular symphony exhibits some of his evolution in his own vein, his own genre. He was trying stuff out, and the people of Prague accepted that.
Yeah, well, Mozart was good for when he was commissioned. He didn't always make a good living, but when he was, he'd give you whatever he thought you wanted. So like when he wrote the Paris Symphony, in the first 20 seconds, he gives everything that the Parisians loved about music. I mean, it was just chock full of like Parisian little licks here and there. And but we're not quite sure why he wrote this symphony, this Prague Symphony. Number one, it's not the conventional 4 movements. Usually you have an introduction and an upbeat movement, then a slower movement, and then a minuet of some sort. Now, Beethoven would turn them into very fast, what we call scherzos, but in Mozart's time and Haydn's time, they'd be a minuet, a very stately, courtly dance. Then the last movement that's upbeat. Mozart leaves out the minuet completely out of the Prague Symphony, and it's never about expediency because he wrote so fast. He never had more than one draft.
Yeah.
The first draft was the final draft.
That takes a special genius.
Well, he was definitely a genius.
Yeah.
This is the remarkable and odd thing about Mozart. I mean, he never had a draft. It was more of a pain for him to write it down than it was to compose. 3 movements. Leaves out the minuet. The only conjecture that some people have suggested is maybe because in Vienna, where he was not as successful, but where he spent most of his career, they would have demanded that minuet. Mm-hmm. But in Prague, a more earthly peasant type of town, they wouldn't need that minuet.
They can forgo that little dance.
Yeah,
number.
and that's the only suggestion that maybe. But he definitely was popular in Prague. He was writing this right between when he wrote The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, 2 of his most popular operas. And so he's writing this, late 1770s, and he's writing this during a time where he's really becoming popular. So he starts trying new things. In fact, this is his most Beethoven-like symphony that he ever wrote. It's his most romantic. It's very fun. It's very powerful. It's dramatic. I think that's why I like it, because it sounds so not like Mozart at times. It's so aggressive. The history here, though, is one, I won a national competition with this piece when I was very young. Oh. And secondly, when I came here as a guest conductor, it's about 17 years ago, they usually let the conductor choose the piece, and you got to choose the concert for the most part, but they said that we have one requirement: you must conduct Mozart's Prague. And that was the last time I performed it. So it's been 17 years since I personally performed. I haven't performed it anywhere since. But that was the last time that Helena Symphony's done it. Last time I've done it was 17 years ago.
Well, that's
before
remarkable.
I was even a music director.
Returning to your roots in the
A little
community.
bit. I mean, I've done this piece a lot, but it's been 17 years.
Yeah.
So, and Mozart is hard. It's a hard, and Haydn, but it's a hard sound to get, to do it really well. Every phrase must sort of lilt, taper, decay. No matter what the dynamics are, every phrase has to sort of fade out just slightly. It's a hard sound to get. So we'll work on Mozart.
Yeah. Do you coax that out of all of the musicians? Is it something that everybody has to attune
Yes,
themselves to?
it's hard to do. It's hard to do to get this very fine. It's almost, I often compare it to like lace. Lace is so intricate. You could see the pattern, but you could easily tear it. And that's sort of like Mozart and Haydn's sound. There's a sense that you have to, there's this elegance about it that you have to sort of constantly put a shimmer on. There's this beautiful, not over too much vibrato and not too much angst like in Beethoven. There's this raw energy. This is a polished sound and pristine, very silvery, but it doesn't ever get too lush. It always tapers a little bit. Yeah. And so it's a hard sound to get. So you work very hard. You don't have the orchestras that you have at Brahms and Wagner and Tchaikovsky. There's no trombones and no percussion other than timpani. Pairs of winds. We won't use 24 violins. We'll use 15 violins, and they won't be sitting to my left. The first violins will be to my left. My second violins will be to my right, opposite. Usually the cellos or violas are there.
Yeah.
And the cellos are next to the first violins, and the basses are on my left instead of over here on my right. More of a classic, will be set up in a classical format too.
Yeah.
So it's very different.
Well, it all fits into this classical mold, but there's a lot of variety within it, obviously.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's not, there's so much diversity of music in there, and the Mozart Symphony is maybe that and the Haydn Concerto. They're the two big meaty pieces, and they're each bookended by a Beethoven overture.
Yeah.
So we could have ignored Beethoven entirely if we wanted, and just done Mozart or just done Haydn and Mozart, but Beethoven takes it to the next level. So I did want, and because Mozart's Prague Symphony is lush and romantic, more romantic than perhaps usual, I wanted some nod to Beethoven in there. So that's how this all works.
Well, as usual, it's a great thing to look forward to on March 23rd at the Civic Center. Sounds fantastic.
We're very excited. We'll be announcing about Symphony Under the Stars
Ah.
and a lot of other fun things too.
Yet another reason to go to the Symphony. And we'll see you again here next time. We'll see you at the Symphony.